Okay, let's dive right into this fascinating explainer. We are going to look at something that completely transforms how we think about measuring our own learning. Because let's be honest, if you've ever sat in a classroom, taken a corporate training course, or just tried to pick up a new skill, you have experienced educational assessment. But the way we actually measure success, it has undergone a massive evolution. We've shifted from a very rigid, traditional model to something beautifully integrated and dynamic. So today we're going to break down exactly how that transformation happened.
We all know that stressful feeling, right? Sitting at a desk, heart pounding, waiting to get a massive final exam handed back to you, kind of feeling like that single number defines literally everything you've learned. Well, for a very long time, the answer to the question, are tests just about getting a final grade, was a resounding yes. But today, we're going to see how educational theory has evolved to make learning so much more empowering. We're talking about shifting from being a passive receiver of a grade to an active, engaged participant in your own success.
So let's kick things off with Act 1, the vocabulary and the old way.
First up, we have assessment of learning, which we'll call AOL for short. This is the traditional, summative approach that, frankly, we are all probably the most familiar with. It's exactly what it sounds like, a strict measurement of what you have learned after the instruction is completely finished. Think about your final grades, your big certifications, those stressful end-of-year exams. The teacher teaches, you take a test, and you get a final judgment at the very end of the road.
Next, we have assessment for learning, or AFL. Now notice the slight change in the preposition there, because it honestly changes the whole meaning. AFL acts as a check-in while the learning is actually still happening. This is the feedback provided by teachers during the process. The goal here isn't to slap a final grade on you, but rather to spot any misconceptions early on and to help the teacher adjust and improve their instruction on the fly.
Finally, we have assessment as learning, or ALL, and this is the most modern piece of the puzzle. This is when you, the student, totally take the wheel. It's all about becoming an active participant who monitors and reflects on your own progress. Instead of waiting for a teacher to tell you how you're doing, you are self-assessing, figuring out where your own weak spots are, and setting your own learning goals. It's a total game changer. Now, if we look at the traditional setup, think of it as a giant pyramid, where assessment of learning takes up the massive, heavy foundation. It's the largest part of the system by far. Assessment for learning sits in the middle, and assessment as learning is just this tiny little sliver balancing at the very top. What this means is that the traditional system places the absolute greatest emphasis on those end-of-learning judgments. In this model, the student basically plays a very passive role. You're really just waiting to be judged. To make this super concrete, picture this classic scenario. A math teacher spends 4 straight weeks teaching fractions. At the end of those 4 weeks, they give a massive final examination that is worth 40% of the entire course grade. This is textbook assessment of learning. It simply measures what students retained after the instruction is already over. And if you didn't understand fractions back in week 2, well, tough luck, because by the time week 4 rolls around, the class is moving on and your grade is definitely going to show it.
Moving right along to Act 2, the shift to active learning.
So what happens when we completely flip the script? The whole system inverts. In a reconfigured model, assessment as learning, that student-driven AAL, becomes the largest piece, serving as the solid foundation. Assessment for learning stays in the middle, but that traditional heavy assessment of learning, it shrinks down to just the smallest slice at the very top. In this reconfigured setup, education suddenly places its greatest emphasis on student ownership.
And this shift brilliantly illustrates a crucial change in mindset. Under the old model, the passive student's only real question was, what grade did I get? But in this new, reconfigured model, active students start asking, how can I improve? The entire focus moves away from simple grading and certification and points directly towards self-regulation and continuous improvement.
But for this to actually work, the teacher's role has to totally evolve too. Instead of just lecturing at the front of the room and handing out tests, teachers become facilitators. They provide explicit opportunities for students to take ownership. They are literally handing students the tools to self-assess, to deeply reflect on their work, to set their own personalized goals, and to continually monitor their own progress.
Let's look at an amazing example of this active participation. Imagine you're wrapping up a big science investigation. In the past, you just hand it in and cross your fingers, right? But here, instead of just hoping for the best, you are given a rubric ahead of time. You use that rubric to evaluate your own work, actively catching your own mistakes and identifying areas for improvement before you ever actually submit it to the teacher. That is assessment as learning in action.
Which brings us to a major breakthrough in Act 3. the renewed assessment cube.
The absolute newest idea in educational theory breaks out of that flat 2D pyramid entirely. It's captured perfectly by this quote: "These three assessments happen together rather than independently." The renewed assessment cube reveals that AOL, AFL, and AAL are not just separate layers or distinct stages where you finish one and simply move on to the next. Instead, they form a continuous, highly interconnected ecosystem.
Imagine this as a 3D space where information flows in all directions. It's a continuous loop. For example, the results from a final exam, the ALL, can actually be used to inform how a teacher approaches their future lessons, which is AFL. Then that teacher's real-time feedback helps students reflect on their own study habits, that's AAL, and finally, those personal reflections ultimately improve the student's performance on the next big test. Teachers and students are constantly moving among all three forms to support one another throughout the entire journey.
Let's ground this with a real-world example to show how seamless this is. Imagine you're sitting in a Year 5 geometry class. Step 1, the teacher asks the room, "How do you actually know this shape is a parallelogram?" They're checking for misconceptions and giving immediate feedback. That is assessment for learning. Step 2, a student compares their own worksheet to a checklist, realizes they totally confused rectangles with parallelograms, and corrects their own mistake on the spot. That's assessment as learning. Step 3, at the very end of the unit, that same student completes a geometry project that contributes to their final grade. That's assessment of learning. See, it's a completely seamless, continuous cycle.
All right, time for the grand summary.
To really synthesize this entire journey we've been on, think about where we started. We began with the traditional pyramid, right? The main focus there was almost entirely assessment of learning, just grading and certification. Then, education evolved into the reconfigured pyramid, which prioritized a much greater emphasis on assessment as learning and real student ownership. Finally, we arrive at the renewed assessment cube, this brilliant, coherent ecosystem where all three, AOL, AFL, and AAL, work together continuously, constantly informing and strengthening each other.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to reflect on your own lifelong learning journey. Whether that's at school, at work, or even just when you're diving into your personal hobbies, ask yourself, how do you measure your own success? Are you stuck passively waiting for a final judgment at the bottom of a traditional pyramid, or are you actively self-assessing, taking in feedback, and thriving in a continuous multidimensional cube? The choice of how you approach your own learning is ultimately up to you. Keep learning, keep reflecting, and we will see you next time.